I'm Kurt Munz from Bocconi University. This research is primarily the work of my very talented PhD student Shahryar Mohsenin. I'm presenting today on his behalf due to a visa issue. In this research, we are interested in learning how perceptual disfluency affects consumer choices. Perceptual disfluency refers to the feelings of difficulty experienced when encoding information. So various elements common in the marketplace can contribute to perceptual disfluency. For example, if a company uses a hard-to-read font in their packaging, visual designers will also present text on top of background images. While they may be more visually appealing, these images can make reading the text more difficult, leading to disfluency. You see this very commonly in flyers like this one from a local electronics store. In e-commerce settings, a marketer or retailer may upload a photo that does not have enough resolution for the context. If the image contains text, it might be blurry, making it hard to read. This can also be a problem for screens of various sizes. If a marketing element was created for a certain size screen, it can be sometimes more difficult to read on a different sized device. So, in general, when evaluating individual products, perceptual disfluency can have a negative impact. Consumers can mistake the negative feeling caused by for example, the disfluency due to a bad font as their feelings about the product that they are evaluating. However, the effect of perceptual disfluency on relative preferences between options remains less well understood despite its critical importance for marketing managers. There has been some research on this topic in the context of logical puzzles like the CRT, a quiz game with questions that have an intuitive but incorrect answer. Performance improved when the questions were written in a hard-to-read, disfluent font. The authors reasoned that the research participants interpreted the perceptual disfluency due to the fonts as a metacognitive cue that something was amiss or suspicious. In turn, this prompted them to think more critically and analytically, allowing them to overcome their initial intuitions and provide more correct answers. So these results were interpreted as relating to an analytical cognitive processing style, which favors careful attention, deep thinking, intensive reasoning, and thorough scrutiny of available information. If this shift to a more analytical processing also occurs in consumer decision-making settings, perceptual disfluency could also shift preferences away from intuitively appealing cues such as brands, recommendations, countries of origin, and toward information that requires careful scrutiny, such as numerical product specifications. So in line with this idea, Alter et al. Found that when the product review information was presented in a disfluenced font, participants' favorability ratings were influenced more by argument quality than by communicator attractiveness. However, when a particular task or context causes people to interpret the meaning of their disfluency differently, it can also lead to a different influence on the judgments and decisions they make. And some researchers have proposed that consumers can make a different inference from disfluency than the one we just discussed. Specifically, instead of interpreting it as a sign that something is amiss or suspicious, when making consumer choices, consumers may mistake perceptual disfluency for choice difficulty, which is a feeling of indecision experienced when contemplating trade-offs between options. This can lead them to defer making a choice or to choose a compromise option. The results suggest that consumers try to avoid making trade-offs when they experience perceptual disfluency. However, it's less clear how perceptual disfluency may affect consumer choices when trade-offs cannot be avoided. For example, when choosing between two options and there is no option to defer and there is no compromise option. So we asked how else might consumers react to choice difficulty. So in addition to deferral and compromise, it seems possible that consumers might react to feeling unsure about what to choose by relying on information they do feel sure about. In other words, they may rely on information that feels more familiar to them based on their own past experience, rather than rely on information they have only just encountered in the choice context and must come to appreciate through careful attention and scrutiny, like numerical product specifications. As a result, they may be more likely to choose options that are offered by a familiar brand, are from a preferred country of origin, or are recommended by a familiar source. So the information that we predict will become more influential when consumers feel unsure about what to choose, like familiar brands, tends to be intuitively appealing without careful analytical processing. Thus, it could indicate that consumers experiencing processing disfluency when choosing between products will use a more intuitive and less analytical information processing style than otherwise. We test this idea in a series of 9 experiments, all of which were pre-registered. Additionally, the materials and data for each will be posted online upon publication. The first experiment has 2 purposes. First, we aim to replicate the work showing that perceptual disfluency can lead to choice deferral. Second, we aim to advance on this prior work by showing that it can also lead consumers to rely on familiar brands and preferred countries of origin. In all the studies, we examine a choice between 2 options. One should be preferred if consumers are processing information more intuitively. It has a more familiar brand or a recommendation, something along these lines. In this example, that's brand B, which has a more familiar brand. If you look also at the brand for brand A, Itochin, that suggests a Chinese country of origin, which could also impact choices. The other option should be more appealing when consumers are processing information more analytically. That is, it compares favorably on product specifications, and you can see that that's brand A in this example. In this experiment, we manipulated disfluency using fonts. In the disfluent conditions, participants saw these same 2 stimuli, but presented in a hard-to-read font. Order was counterbalanced in every study. For this experiment, the DV was a trinary choice between option A, option B, and choice deferral, though in the later studies, participants only had a choice between the 2 physical options. So we replicated the fast findings related to deferral. You can see that on the 2 bars farthest on the right. We also found support for our hypothesis. You can see that in the farthest 2 bars on the left. Specifically, when the font was disfluent and hard to read, participants were more likely to choose the Hamilton Beach Blender with the familiar brand. We also replicated this main effect across various disfluency manipulations. In study 1A and B, we used fonts, with 1B being incentive compatible. In 1C, we used background images in the context of product packaging. In study 1D, we manipulated the image quality by adjusting the resolution of the image containing text. And in 1E, we found similar results when manipulating screen sizes. I'll skip study 2. And so in this study, choosing a better brand or recommended product suggests that participants are processing information more intuitively and less analytically. In this study, we test that idea directly through a mediation analysis. So we manipulated disfluency using background images. So these same images were presented on a white background or with a distracting background image. The background images were counterbalanced in addition to the counterbalancing the product order. And as before, and consistent with our hypotheses, participants chose a more familiar brand when they experienced disfluency due to the background image. We also measured analytical and intuitive processing using the scales that you see here. We calculated a different score, what we call processing depth, as the score for analytical minus the score for intuitive, and we found that this measure mediated the choice. So this is consistent with our hypotheses. In the next experiment, we look for boundary conditions. We predict that disfluent fonts will increase reliance on recommendations, but not when consumers are warned that fonts cause the disfluency. So recall that Novemsky et al. Proposed that consumers misinterpret the feeling of disfluency, of perceptual disfluency, as choice difficulty, feelings of indecision experienced when contemplating trade-offs between the options. So if consumers realizing that they're not experiencing choice difficulty and are instead aware that the difficulty is due to the hard-to-read font, the effects on their choices should be smaller. Thus, in this experiment, we added a third condition where we warned participants about the source of disfluency. We said, please notice that the information presented next is difficult to read because of the background image. And this manipulation diminished the effect of disfluency. You can see that the new condition was not significantly different from the fluent condition. In the next experiment, we rely on a similar logic. If the effects are due to participants misinterpreting perceptual disfluency as choice difficulty, reasons that they should not make such an inference when they are not actually making a choice. Thus, we asked some participants to make a choice as before, so this replicates the past experiments, but we asked others to instead identify which option had better specs and features. So the idea being that when they're asked this question, they shouldn't misinterpret the disfluency they're experiencing as choice difficulty. As predicted, this manipulation moderated the effect. The effects of perceptual disfluency due to a harder-to-read font significantly affected the consumer choices on the left, replicating the past studies, but did not affect a different task, which was identifying which had better specs and features, the bars on the right. We reasoned that this was because for the latter task, participants would not mistake the disfluency for choice difficulty, feelings of indecision while choosing. Okay, so in sum, people can misinterpret perceptual disfluency for choice difficulty, a feeling of indecision when contemplating trade-offs between options. This can lead them to avoid trade-offs by deferring choice or choosing a compromise option, which has been shown before. And in this research, we show that it also can lead them to choose intuitively appealing options, those with easily noticed and understood information. Specifically, we investigated the role of brands, countries of origins, and recommendations. This result is important theoretically because it is the opposite of our current understanding of this subject. And it's also important for retailers and marketing managers to understand because it can impact these common marketing situations. This is another example of a local grocery store where these flyers are common. Okay, thanks very much for your attention.